Thanks, everyone. Welcome to those who are at the NU here today. On behalf of the Statistical Society of Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, in our case, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and their connections to land, sea and community. And we would like to pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who might be here today or joining us online. So also welcome to those online today. And my name is Luca Maestrini. I'm the current president of the SSA ACT branch here in Canberra. And a bit of housekeeping first. For those who are joining online, please mute yourselves. And if you would like to interact with Samantha, just unmute yourselves, I guess, because you would like to keep this talk quite interactive, right?
Yes, definitely.
So usually we keep questions for the very end, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and talk to us here. And also those here in the audience, you can raise your hands and then interact with Samantha. And I would like to provide some details on the SSA for those who are not affiliated with the SSA. We are the national body that represents statisticians from across the country. And if you would like to know more about our society, you can Google www.statsos.org.au. So, Samantha, welcome to Samantha Law Choi, who more or less just arrived from Queensland today. And Samantha recently joined Matter Research Institute at the University of Queensland as a senior biostatistician across the Stillbirth Centre of Excellence and the Genesis Perinatal Research Team in Mater Hospital. Samantha is also adjunct associate professor at the Griffith Institute of Education and Research, Griffith University. And talk about Samantha's main research interest on applications of statistics and methodology in statistics. We can say that these lie in conceptual modeling and causal inference, Bayesian statistical modeling, and modeling complex systems. And Samantha's research contributions have spanned several fields with highly cited or impactful publications in ecology, environment, psychology, education, criminology, and health. We are all looking forward to this talk, which looks promising, and it will be interactive, so it will be different from what we're used to. And so one more reason to be looking forward to this. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you very much, Luca. Yes, and thank you very much, Emmy, for the wonderful work you've been doing to hostess me to come here. So today I'm talking on a topic that was handpicked by you guys, I believe, from a list of things that I've been doing in the past few years. And I would say that this has been one of the most challenging projects we worked on, so I can understand your interest. We got a 6-month project together with the deadline for proposing the project over Christmas, of course. They didn't want too many proposals, I guess. And we ended up doing 6 months of red tape to deal with the Indigenous research issues in order to do a 6-month project. So, and then we brought on 7 postdocs to help complete the project. It was quite a large project in a very short amount of time. So what I'm talking about today is the interesting combination of research methods that supported this project, which was called Weaving Stories of Strength. And this was all about how do you bring in the Indigenous perspectives when you are designing curriculum and delivering curriculum in schools. And to do that in an ethical way that recognises Indigenous is respectful towards Indigenous peoples and their ways of doing things. So I'd like to acknowledge all of my co-authors, and there's quite a list. So Tasha Riley and Troy Meston were the project leaders. Troy is an Indigenous man, and he is now a professor. So at the time of this project, he was a PhD student, and now he's become a professor at Griffith Uni. So the other co-authors include Daniela Vasco, who's the chair of the Early Career and Student Statisticians Network, but they also include a few education researchers, early career researchers. So Chesley, Brittany, Unji and Sanal are all early career, as well as Unjay, Arij and Emily. Which keyboard will I use? Next. Yes. So I'm now currently just moved from Griffith University, where I did most of this work, and I'm working at Marta Research Institute, and I'm sitting in a group in the Stillbirth Centre of Research Excellence next to some Indigenous researchers. So I will be working on Indigenous research methods in the future. We have projects on bereavement, sorry business, and timing of baby, my baby movements, a lot of things that are specifically designed not just for mainstream Australians, but also for Indigenous Australians. So before we go on, I'd like to give Marta's acknowledgement of country, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their ongoing custodianship, pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue the cultural and spiritual connections to country. We acknowledge the diversity across Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, language and practices. And that's really key to what this type of research, where you're trying to design an overarching sort of idea, but still keeping in mind that all of these communities are unique in their own right. And in particular at Marta, it is vital that all healthcare services respectfully manage the protocol and provide a culturally positive healthcare experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when going through sorry business. And so this artwork was by Leona McGrath, who's a Wupperburra and Kukuk Yalanji woman. At Griffith University, these artworks were produced during the National Sorry Day in the National Apology to the Stolen Generation by people in the educational research area. And so the artwork on the left is by Glenn Barry, and the artwork on the right is by Sid Dodge. So today's talk, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to my visit here. It's fairly unexpected, given that I've only just started at the Marta, to find that there's many overlaps with my previous work and current work, and that you're all interested in this topic. So to just give you an outline of what we'll talk about here today, it's a challenge when you do talk about anything with mixed methods. It means you have to cover the qual and the quant and how you've combined them. And so the talk tries to traverse all this. It's a little bit at that high level. You can dive into the paper for the details. So today I'm trying to explain it to statisticians instead of the article is kind of written for social and behavioural scientists. So I'll start off by talking about the aims, the role of the methodology. I'll look at set the scene with some of the qualitative methodologies, such as literature review and interviewing. And then I'll talk about how the analysis has some pre-quantitative elements. Not sure that you'd really call them quantitative, but they do form the beginning of many quantitative sort of projects that I've worked on, as well as some qualitative aspects. I'll then talk about the Indigenous research frameworks, which kind of act as an umbrella over the top of everything. I introduced them here in the middle because it doesn't make sense until you kind of put it in context. Then I give you some illustrations, some of the diagrams we produced in the work to explain how all these methodologies came together. And if we have time, I'll do a recap. So has anyone in the room done mixed methods before? One. Okay, so there's one statistic. So I had not realised I was doing mixed methods for a lot of my professional life as a Bayesian statistician doing expert elicitation. It's in fact a mixed method because it involves qualitative interviewing and quantitative using that information in priors in a Bayesian sense. And I'm actually using some of the techniques here. So in terms of the aim, so I just grabbed this out of the article. We had a multidisciplinary team including Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers in Meanjin country, which is Brisbane, working on the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples for this Weaving Stories of Strength project. It was funded by Queensland Education Horizon Research Grant Scheme just after COVID. So that's why we had a compressed timescale. Basically, at the core of this, in a qualitative research, you can interview just 16 people, but in depth. So there were international and national Indigenous experts on education. So they came from countries like Canada, some of the Southeast Asian countries, UK, and I think the US. I'm not sure I remember all of them, but we actually had to divide up the ethics in order to talk to international and national people. And it was much more difficult to get the ethics through for interviewing Australian Indigenous people than it was to get ethics through to interview people overseas. Just a hint for people thinking about doing that themselves. So the reason that we talked to Indigenous experts from outside Australia was to basically generalise beyond not just this diverse set of Indigenous communities within Australia, but also look at how Indigenous peoples address this issue in other countries, especially where they've been colonised and there's still the teaching centres around European perspectives. So these Indigenous experts that we talked to shared their experiences and ideas on how you Indigenise classroom. So this meant not just having an add-on sort of subject on Indigenous art or Indigenous culture, but bringing it in across the curriculum, trickling it in to every subject where you can. And our project actually, because the methodology required to analyse this ended up being quite unique. And so we adopted the Indigenous Holistic Framework by Michelle Pidgeon as an overarching sort of framework, which was quite novel and brought in all those other techniques. And the aim in the end for Tasha Riley, who's the head of the project, was to raise the confidence of teachers who might not be Indigenous themselves, and how do they bring in those Indigenous perspectives, how to do it in a good way. So to me, this was close to my research and expert elicitation. So we were talking to educationalists who are experts, who have a lot of experience in using Indigenous approaches, and a lot of them were operating in these liaison roles, so working between the schools and the government, or between the government and community groups. So that often they were in these sort of complex roles as the nexus and the interface between all of those interested parties. And the aim then was to weave together the common threads of the stories that came up from all these different experts. And so if you start delving into qualitative methods, then you start to encounter ideas like we're using an interpretive paradigm here. So we're talking about how people interpret their experiences, but we're interested in what common elements there are across people. So it's not entirely subjective, it's more interpretive and has a common element across people. So the two research questions to me seemed very similar to the research questions I might have, or at least the second one is, from a Bayesian belief network project or a statistical project, or what I'm finding in the medical area, a prognostic factors kind of study. So the first research question was, what strategies within Indigenous education help teachers become more confident and build their capacity to Indigenise classroom? And then the second question is, what factors help or hinder the teacher's ability to teach about race or indigeneity? So has anyone ever had like a research question like either of those? Has anyone had a what factors type question before? Have you ever seen mixed methods literature on that? No. Yeah, so as statisticians, you might not be aware of this rich other way of dealing with things. So how does a methodology help? So this is the front page of the article. there are 9 diagrams that we created following the method I'm going to be talking about in this article, which is only 10 or so pages, I think. And the final report, though, was about 90,000 words. And this is a list of all the figures. There were 32 diagrams produced altogether. Each diagram resulted from an analysis, which is similar to producing specifying model structure for structural equation models or Bayesian belief networks. So quite a lot of work went into each of those diagrams. And each of those diagrams referred to a literature review as well as talking to the experts. Sometimes it might be leaning more towards what the expert said or what the review said, but it was able to, each diagram could talk to both. And here's just stepping back and looking at the article. You can see how the diagrams are breaking up the flow so that it gives people a change of pace from having dense words, because as you can imagine, the social and behavioural research context, it's quite wordy and there's a much broader vocabulary than you'll encounter in a quantitative science paper. Yeah, yeah, please do.
I'll admit that I really don't know very much about qualitative research, but I have read a lot of Brené Brown, and she's my main example of qualitative research. And my understanding is there's a bunch of interviews. There's looking at kind of what are the similar structures and then building a framework through a decision. Is that kind of what's going on here? Am I close?
So that's one type of qualitative research. So Creswell talks about the big 5 qualitative research areas. One of them is thematic analysis that you're talking about, that Braun and Clark are big on. But there's also ethnography, where you sit there and observe people. It's like ecology, you just observe people. There's phenomenology, where you get people to describe their unique lived experiences, which is closer to expert elicitation. And there's a couple others I can't think off the top of my head. Oh, there's like grounded theory, I think, where you pretend everything comes from your interviews. You've got no prior knowledge and you just interpret what they say. It'll come to me later. But yeah, so qualitative research is huge. There's a wide variety of methods. And what I've noticed is that in some quantitative areas, they think all of qualitative is thematic analysis, and it isn't. It's just one type, 1,000th of the different types. Yeah, good question. And I probably fell into that trap myself too.
I'm willing to admit that I'm ignorant.
Yeah, so I think in my talk on meta-analysis, actually, I give a reference to the Creswell book. Yeah, but you might like to look at the Oxford Handbook on Mixed and Multi-Methods by Hess, Bieber and Johnson. It gives a really good coverage of all sorts of things. Yeah. No. Okay, so that just gives you an idea of what I'm talking about here, these diagrams. And the overarching research method was provided by 2 Indigenous research frameworks. One's the 4 Rs. Has anyone heard of the 4 Rs? And Pigeon's holistic framework. So I'll introduce you to both. And then underneath this framework, there were some qualitative methods, systematic lit review, yarning. Has anyone been involved in yarning? Yeah, so you sit down, have a chat. Everyone knows where people are coming from. They introduce themselves, from their country and their connection to community, and they listen a lot. It's a little bit different to the usual Socrates style of dialogue and debate, which is a bit more confronting, I guess. We brought in some expert elicitation so that we could nail the factors. The thematic analysis is in there. You predicted that. And then you could say that there was some comparative analysis in there too, and the concept mapping was the thing that helped produce the diagrams. So let's have a little bit of a look at the literature review. There is some statistical thinking in literature review. So in my talk on Thursday, I'm talking about meta-analysis and how you can have different styles of literature review. It does not have to be systematic. Like, as statisticians, do we always analyse the census? No. I mean, when I talk to people from the community at a barbecue, they think that's what I do. If I say I'm a statistician, I door knock on census day. But statisticians know that we do much more interesting things to look at large, complex sets of individuals. So why wouldn't we do that in literature review? So next time you do a meta-analysis, you might want to get involved at the beginning and question their style of lit review. But that's Thursday's story. So you can challenge how they're collecting that data, how they're searching for it. Does it have to be everything? And what happens is that people get too many things and then they just become more and more and more and more specific and narrow the search down until it's something they can feasibly look at, but sometimes that's just too narrow. Then in literature review, you need to appraise every study, synthesize what's been said across studies and analyse it. So the question is, must your literature review be systematic? Here we did a systematic review, but we also did other things. Do you need a narrowly defined census? In prognostic studies, when you're talking about predicting future outcomes, you often need to have a much broader perspective so that you catch all those cases that are out of the ordinary or could lead to really bad health outcomes, for instance. In this case, we were using mixed methods approach to literature review, where we didn't just look at the literature, we used experts as a filter for the literature or a replacement for the literature, because the topic was still too new and not necessarily written down because it was about practice. And then, because I'm a statistician, and because I'm experienced in doing expert elicitation, it's like when you get information, you want to put it into a structure that makes it easy to analyse. And so this is this model-centric literature review approach. It's a term we kind of came up with in a project on SEM, but it's basically just creating tables from your systematic lit review that kind of make it easier to do the concept maps, which look a lot like an SEM diagram or BBN diagram. Does that make sense? Yeah. So there's a book here an article here by Grant and Booth, where they came up with the first 15 types of literature review, so the top 3 rows, just so that people realise there's something other than systematic. Okay, so the yellow ones, the ones with the yellow boundaries, are actually types of literature review methods that we use some of those techniques in this study. We didn't just use one technique, we borrowed from different literature review techniques. So here, a general literature review could have a chronological write-up, a conceptual write-up, or a thematic analysis. And then you can make it systematic when you do an exhaustive search and do some assessment of quality and clarify what is known and unknown. You can also do not just a systematic review, but also a systematic search and do a bit more critical thinking in that review. And we also included scoping review, the first phase, because the topic was too new. We couldn't just dive into a carefully, a very precise search term. There was some qualitative systematic lit review in there because we were analysing it using not just a thematic analysis, but other techniques as well. There's critical review in there because they were trying to come up with a big picture of what it all model the factors that have an influence from a qualitative perspective. But then we were trying to map them logically, so that was a model-centric approach. And it's mixed methods because we're not just using one method. And we're also using these pre-quantitative techniques, the concept mapping, the causal, drawing those causal diagrams. And I found, this is from this article by Tricot, some of these issues are coming up under the title of prognostic factor literature reviews in the medical context. Yeah, thanks. So the So the blue ones are more quantitative, borrowing from the quantitative literature. The green ones are sort of sitting halfway between the quant and the qual literature. And the yellow ones are more completely qualitative methods. So you can see that sticking solely to systematic reviews is not necessarily going to suit your project if, like us, you're trying to look at something that's not yet well defined. And you're having to do that as you read the literature. So if you want to learn more about that, we wrote a teaching article for a book on secondary research methods in the built environment. So I think we're chapter 14 right down the bottom. So that's with Fernando Almeida from University of Porto and Judy Rose, who was also mixed methods advisor at Griffith, and she specialised more on the qualitative side, whilst I was more on the quantitative side. So we are writing up this methodology, the literature review methodology, as part of writing up the whole project, and that's in preparation at the moment. So anyone who wants to chat to me about that sort of thing, you're welcome, very welcome. Okay, so we're getting towards interviewing. So has anyone in the room been involved in interviewing? Yeah, what style of interviewing?
It was mostly virtual, so we did like virtual interviews with people on the ground. So we had to prepare some questions up front so that they can be prepared for what kind of question or information we're trying to extract from them. And so we have not taken so I was asking the questions, driving it, and then how best one interview. So
yeah. So you had a semi-structured or structured sort of?
Depending on the nature of the conversation, sometimes you use it to be structured, but sometimes we just let the interview side kind of just share whatever we have.
Yeah.
Just after to structure it back to how we want it. So
yeah. So semi-structured interview is where you're not trying to fixate on asking everyone exactly the same question, like the census, but you're more trying to make sure they're all giving you answers of a similar type, no matter how you got there. So you tailor the question to get similar information from everybody. And the way that this is done in a qualitative setting is they usually have very broad questions with prompts if people can't answer the question. And in this case, we also allowed our Indigenous experts to prepare. We gave them the questions beforehand. And in fact, they didn't have to talk about everything on the list. They could choose what they wanted to talk about. So the interviewing methodology that we used was based on the literature review. And we, instead of interviewing using a purely semi-structured protocol within the qualitative paradigm, we actually used an Indigenous research method called yarning. And within the yarning, I also embedded some principles of structured elicitation of expert knowledge. So here's the definition of yarning. It's more knowledge sharing, really understanding how, who the people are and where that information came from and how it developed. So in a way, some academics do pay a lot of attention to that. Others just use the information and forget where it came from. As statisticians, I think that we're probably more attuned to understanding that stats was developed in education, item response theory models, and that's why you have ability on the x-axis for all the outputs, things like that. So yarning is really about the knowledge from people and about linking information. So connectivity amongst different pieces of information. So they call it a dialogical method, where the aim is not to cover the whole topic, rather it's to get a consensus on what people think about the topic. So when people sit around for a yarn, they're trying to find common ground and trying to come up with a consensus on a specific issue. And it's not just about what you're trying to achieve, it's how you do it. So there has to be respect, a certain protocol be followed, and you need to develop relationships with each person who's involved in that yarning. So all of our yarning was preceded by 2 or 3 meetings by one person on the research team, developed the relationship with the person and had several discussions with them before we had the actual yarn about the project. So here's a nice quote from Miriam Rose Bauman, which emphasises that in yarning you're listening a lot. So in expert elicitation and in interviewing, we often ask the question, we're driving the conversation. In yarning, you sit back and you let the conversation go. So it was quite a different way of doing things for me, because with expert elicitation, we often have a list of things we have to get through. With qualitative interviews, you often only have a short period of time and you're trying to get through things, and so you end up driving what's happening. Yarning is more sitting back and sharing or giving over the ownership of the flow. So that covers the qualitative methodologies for where the data came from. Now I'm going to just touch on the analysis. So not everyone calls expert elicitation seek, but I like to emphasize that elicitation is not just a chat. There's a lot of structure behind it. We often have that semi-structured interview there, which is carefully linked to the statistical model or the statistical technique that we're trying to put the information into. So structured elicitation of expert knowledge, or SEEK, is an acronym that the Sheffield group came up with. So has anyone heard of Tony O'Hagan? He was called a wild subjective Bayesian at a Bayes conference. Because like me, we're one of a very small percentage of Bayesians who sit in this mixed methods end where we're bringing in expert knowledge to specify priors. So SEEK is a bunch of methodologies where you treat, you basically construct interviews where you establish rapport, you set the groundwork, you define things, you make sure everyone has a shared understanding, and that might take an hour before you ask the quantitative questions or before you ask about factors. So it's very different to what, a survey might be, which where you just expect the information sitting on the shelf. It's developing that context so that the numbers they give you, where they're coming from and they know where you're coming from. And you could say these are similar to the types of techniques for eliciting Bayesian belief networks, the model structure or a structural equation model, or even a DAG. Has anyone in the room done that kind of thing? And what techniques did you use for elicitation?
Not for elicitation, but use the models.
You used the models, but how did you get the model?
So just from the particular data set, right? Not
Oh, you did a data-driven.
that.
Ah, right. Anyone else do Bayesian belief networks or structural equation modeling? Yeah, okay. So I find the literature on how you get the model structure is a little bit sparse. So that's something we're working on. It basically says you have to develop a model structure that looks something like this and has these properties, but it doesn't really tell you how to do it. There's a few, a small amount of literature on it, but not a lot. But basically you end up with a causal diagram. So I'll be showing you a couple of those in a minute. So what I'm not talking about here is the kind of expert elicitation where you're quantifying numbers and putting statistical distributions around it. So here's an example where we estimated there are about 800,000 species in total for a certain taxonomic group with a distribution of uncertainty around it. So that's the y-axis is a PDF density. And then this is a plausible range of values. And that was obtained by looking at how many were named species in the database, how many had been discovered but unnamed, and then how many species were across the whole marine environment and how many hadn't been discovered yet because I hadn't sampled them. So that's the kind of structured elicitation of expert knowledge that is used for quantification, and that's not the type of elicitation I'm talking about here. What I am talking about here is elicitation of model structure. So here's an example from some recent work with an honours student. She's presenting at 2 conferences this year, and we're writing up an article based on her work. She's an excellent student doing a PhD at the University of Adelaide. So Stephanie Fawkes. That's the citation of her honours thesis with Anne Royko as principal supervisor. So in her work, she was looking at how antimicrobial resistance in organisms or genes could come into the influence of a advanced water treatment system. So this is developing recycled water, not treating sewage effluent. And you could have all different sort of things affecting that. You could have trying to purify this water, get rid of these nasty little things in the water using membranes to filter it. And if those membranes are fouled or contaminated, then that prevents it from working well. And then all sorts of things can happen to the membranes after that, which affects their efficacy. And then you might end up with these antimicrobial resistant organisms, things like they've developed a resistance to antibiotics and things like that floating around in our water, and we don't want them. So no one had really come up with a conceptual model of how this worked. So she spent 8 sessions working with experts to come up with 5 of these types of diagrams. A lot of work. And her whole honours thesis is basically constructing these conceptual models. So one of the most cited guidelines is by Bruce Marcotte and colleagues in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research, would you believe, back in 2006. And he gives guidelines for how you develop these these causal diagrams that sit behind Bayesian belief networks. Has anyone ever encountered his guidelines? It says things like, you must try to have dichotomous variables. You must have only, 1 or 2 variables affecting children nodes, affecting parent. But it was written back in 2006, and we hadn't really updated those guidelines to represent what our computers can cope with these days. People are still following it and dichotomizing everything. So we all know what problems that leads to. But yeah, so we were using these techniques that are not well explored in the literature. So we were embedding some of these expert elicitation techniques to look at the relationships amongst variables. For us, we wanted to know what factors could be helping success for integrating Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum. So we embedded that within the yarning. And our aim was to bring to the surface these factors that could help or hinder Indigenising the classroom. And what I've found working with qualitative researchers is they put things into a package called, is it Nudist? No, it used to be called Nudist. I can't remember the name of the package, but they put their interview transcripts into the package. It divides it up into paragraphs. And then they kind of get these themes, they code themes to every paragraph, and they forget that all these paragraphs are in a sequence. When you do expert elicitation, however, it's really important to know what order things were said because that provides context. So we're looking at a sequence. The conversation starts over here, meanders around, loops around something, and finally kind of comes in and defines something of interest about factors. So the expert elicitation kind of approaches give you direct and indirect methods for exploring these factors. You can ask someone, what factors affect success integrating into Indigenous perspectives in the classroom? And you might get some useful answers. Or you can go a roundabout way, like my PhD supervisor, Tony Pettit, is English, And he used to always do things in a roundabout way, never in a direct way. Thank you. So there are indirect and direct methods for exploring and revealing these factors. You can ask the questions in different ways. So you might focus on something that has only come up in a very roundabout way in the conversation and at the end of the conversation rather than at the beginning. And then you might want to dive deeply into it when you find it in a conversation. The other thing that the expert elicitation did was to shift the kinds of standard questions that qualitative researchers come up with by moving them, changing the way they were asked. I can't give you detail. I didn't want to overload you with details, to just give you the general idea of what we were doing. So we changed some of the questions, and we also made sure to pay attention to the framing, conditioning, and sequencing of things that we asked. So it meant that before they told us about this thing, which was like a fact, and then we drove that conversation a little bit towards more clearly defining what a factor was, we paid attention to what had been said in the conversation leading up to that. And that meant that once we, found a factor coming up in the conversation, we could clarify the definition, probe that definition and how it was connected to different, how did that factor affect the success? What would map out all the causal links? So this is very different to the way that a qualitative researcher sees an interview transcript, which is to divide it up and lose all that sequencing. So we're writing that up. So in terms of analysis, I thought I'd just give you a feel for analysing the transcripts, getting to the thematic analysis, the Braun and Clark type of approach. So you could say that it's a very mixed and multi-method that involves all of these 6 different methods in analysing the interview transcripts. We were looking at the factors and how they were affecting the success. We were doing visualizations in the diagrams. We were using the elicitation, embedding it within the Indigenous research methods that I haven't quite got to, doing some thematic analysis and using this critical and narrative analysis over the top. So there's a lot going on. You could say that the qualitative side and the quantitative side, this is more qualitative, these are more quantitative skills or pre-quantitative skills, and these are kind of mixed method or integrated sort of analysis methods. I might skip over is anyone really interested in thematic analysis? Do you want me to define it? I wanted to introduce you to the Indigenous research frameworks. So Kirkness and Barnhart came up with these 35 years ago, the 4Rs framework. It was all about guiding research with Indigenous communities, and the 4 principles are respect, respecting Indigenous people and their ways of doing things, taking responsibility if you're
Sorry, we are having some technical issues. All right. I guess I don't have your slides.
Do you want
maybe-
me to? I've got them on.
Let me get-
Sure.
You want to share through my one?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that would be.
Right.
I think Emmy will count.
Might be quicker.
No, I
You
didn't know
don't have
that.
the right thing. Oh. You put it in. Yeah. You go to.
Okay.
Yep, and a new visit. And then choose the slides, BC PPTX down bottom. And then just scroll down. But by a bit further. Oh, not that far. To this, a little bit further up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
There.
Okay. So. Control.
You will need to share that one though.
All right. So.
Can you share that?
Yeah. View presentation mode. This one, right? But I don't use PowerPoint that often. So. Probably.
You need to share on Zoom though. I think at the moment it's not.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, yep.
Getting there.
Screen.
So maybe I should just close some personal stuff here.
Thank you.
Okay, we're getting there. Then you're welcome. Yeah.
Just need to be on view.
Can you go to your PowerPoint screen and make it that presentation mode? Done.
All right. Okay.
That's
Okay. Sorry, we are back. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay,
Anyway,
thank
so-
you.
6:40. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this framework by Michelle brings in layers from the individual up to the community.
It's computer.
Oh, this computer. Okay, and also acknowledges that there's different ways that you can be focusing your research on the physical, intellectual, spiritual, emotional aspects of.
I'll do this one.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right, we will have coordinated slides. Oops. Yep. So this is an example of a figure from the article, figure 7, which is talking about holistic assessment. So who here in the room does any assessment, some teaching? Yeah, not many. Okay, so
We assess students. Or
Yeah.
We assess the quality of our teaching.
you can assess students, research students, any assessment? Yeah, so holistic assessment is kind of like a bit of a buzzword, but in the Indigenous research context, you can kind of, the things that were coming up in our conversations with the experts were experiential learning, which sat between the physical and intellectual sort of axes. The culturally safe environment was really important, which sits between intellectual and spiritual. The community focused methods, which engage the spiritual and the emotional, because it's all about culture. And then at the boundary between physical, or the overlap between physical and emotional, was collaboration and reflection. So we were able to use Michelle Pidgeon's framework there to help interpret what the Indigenous experts were talking about as important to a holistic assessment of the whole person. Okay, and then on the side there, you can see that you need to put these into use, create more comprehensive assessments where your performance criteria are indicators rather than elements of competence. So this is an example of a diagram where we really focused on the holistic assessment, holistic Indigenous research framework that Michelle Pidgeon came up with in a Canadian context. In terms of concept mapping, I'll just quickly go through an example. In the report and the article, we organised all of our analyses of the literature and experts under the 4 Rs. And so section 4.1 was about respect. I won't go into detail. Figure 2 is all about experts' insights on Indigenous consultation and representation, which is an important thing if you're ever going to be working with Indigenous people. In this diagram, you can see this pillar here is something that has to be in place to enable all these factors to help build success. So Indigenous representation and leadership with support systems needed to be in the education system, and that came up consistently across all our experts. And we aligned that with the responsibility aspect of the 4 Rs. Ensuring that Indigenous people could share responsibility for decisions made about teaching, especially where we wanted to bring in Indigenous perspectives. Then respect, ethical and appropriate representation of Indigenous content in schools. This non-Indigenous people needed to learn how to do this in a respectful way. Relevance meant how do you bring it into the curriculum and what aspects of curriculum to make it really helpful for the students and relevant to what the teachers were trying to teach. Oops, I went backwards. And then reciprocity was making sure that Indigenous voices, in fact, inviting elders into the classroom is a really good way of showing reciprocity. And that came up again and again in the interviews. This was all contextualized in a local way, and all these expert educationalists were saying you need to bring in elders from the local communities, which is not how government departments generally do things. There was we tried to keep all our graphical language consistent, but you can look at that in the report. I won't go through all the details. I just wanted to show you that these arrows are the conceptual mapping of how these factors or these pillars of things that you need in the system to make all the factors work, how they're influencing the different things in the model, the concept map. So there's an arrow here saying that you need Indigenous representation to enable ethical and appropriate representation of Indigenous content. You need that representation to enable the Indigenous perspectives to fit into the curriculum. And this is representing what people were saying. If you can fit those Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum, then you're enabling Indigenous voices to be heard. Oh, sorry, going backwards. And if you ensure their voices are heard, then that comes around full circle and helps assist with ethical and appropriate representation. There's also a link out here. This pillar, ensuring there's representation leadership, also assists Indigenous voices to be heard. So basically we're encoding the logic of what these experts were saying in the interviews by going through carefully and drawing in arrows only when there was evidence in the interview transcripts across several people. So that's just a taster of how those diagrams came to be. I knew I wouldn't have time to go into the nitty-gritty of expert elicitation methods. I tried to give you an overview of qualitative and quantitative methods that were required in this project to give you a feeling for mixed methods in case you're thinking of doing some. So in conclusion, I'll just skip some of those slides that are just recapping what I've already said. If you can pair your quantitative analysis with qualitative, it can provide a lot more depth. It can link everything together in that sequence of ideas. The quantitative, on the other hand, helps to highlight patterns that happen across people. So this generalizability that is hard to do with qual. These qual techniques are equally well developed as quant techniques, and the interview transcripts, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what they contained to draw those 32 diagrams. It would take a long time to harvest all that information. And the quant techniques for looking at the logic of how factors contribute to success was really helpful for the qualitative researchers to summarise what was in all this very wordy text. When talking to Indigenous researchers, they found the diagrams very helpful. They helped navigate complex text, and in a way that, you know, a lot of their art is very conceptual as well. So they found that they liked this kind of approach to doing things. They found the 4Rs framework was intriguing in that it seemed to work well in all those 32 diagrams. The way of dividing things up into 4 principles. It was intriguing that it worked. But one thing I need to work on more with the team is how we differentiate what was and was not encoded from what was and was not stated. So differentiating what we chose to put in the diagrams versus what was said. So we need to be a bit clearer about that source of uncertainty. Okay, thank you. And I should just put up all the thank yous for Marta. Marta has a lot of supporters, and for Griffith, we were supported with the Education Horizon Research Grant Scheme. So thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. Yeah, any questions from the audience here? Yeah, Ben?
Thanks, Helen. I really enjoyed the paper and how you connected a lot of the results and the 4R headings. And that really useful way of shaping it. I was wondering what the reception was from, say, the Queensland government or other bodies that were in charge of curricula. Like, have they seen this? How have they received it? Are they enacting it?
It's very new. It has not been through the whole review process in terms of they've reviewed the report, which only got put out last end of 2023, and the article came out in 2024. It's still going through operationalising, if you will. So we've probably had more feedback from other academics than government. I'm not sure if you've worked with government before. I did some work with government in 2017, 2018, actually with Daniela, looking at how do you predict what kinds of sites in a forest will attract more illegal dumping. And the report came out, I think, last year that we'd given them back in 2018. So these things take time and they have to go through many processes. But they were really keen on the project because anything with a literature review then enables them to build guidelines. It also sets up future work for people in GIER to develop training for teachers. So there has been positive feedback in that regard that they'd like to develop some teaching professional development. Yeah, to help with this. So yeah, it's still coming. That's a good question.
Out of Zoom again, sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
About knowing if there were any specific criteria on which those 16 Indigenous researchers were chosen from 4 different countries. So was there any specific criteria like did we choose?
Yeah, I didn't go through that in a lot of detail. Basically, they needed to be working in a situation where they needed to try to bring, either they were trying to bring Indigenous perspectives into their own classroom. So we had some teachers in very remote parts of Australia who were basically operating on their own, trying to do that and working with local community to help. And they met a lot more barriers than people who, for example, we talked to one Canadian educationalist whose role was, he had a government appointment to sit between community, First Nations and the school system. so not individual schools, but and coordinate the integration of his role included integrating Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum, as well as, yeah, a bit broader than that. So there was a range of people interviewed. I haven't gone into those details. They're in the article, but happy to talk about them if you like.
Yeah, I'm from UC,
Hi.
and we're trying to implement some Indigenous perspective into our units.
Mm.
And the problem that we are facing is how, and this is a main suggestion I want you to clarify a bit. How would you argue on, or what would be the difference, or how would you defend the position of using, for instance, the yarn method or methodology instead of the traditional interview? So how can I argue about, you see that we really want to use this instead of this tool? So that Indigenous perspective, again, something that is normally used as very traditional.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's
Traditional according to who?
but we don't use a traditional at university, so we use these methods, we use this way to do like interviews. So how we would argue of using this instead?
Well, you could argue that using the 4Rs framework, using yarning is a very respectful approach. Thank you. A very respectful approach to Indigenous people. It shows that you're willing to listen to them using their the way that they come to decisions, basically, because you're wanting to achieve a consensus about how best to incorporate that Indigenous perspective into curriculum or receive their viewpoint on things. So if you can meet them on their terms, then using the yarning method can be very helpful. There are quite a few articles on yarning. So I had an excerpt there and we had a little bit cited in the article, but we used a yarning methodology ourselves on a previous project where we were looking at how Indigenous art could help in the classroom when you wanted to discuss sensitive issues about race or indigeneity. And we were yarning amongst ourselves about how difficult the project, the challenges of the project itself, but we used yarning to talk to teachers who were using artwork in their teaching. So yarning is not as hard as what you might think, but it's really just a shift in your attitude.
Yeah, basically that's the argument that I need to put in the table. Yeah,
you need to allow them time. It's not just a one-off. You have to develop a relationship. You have to be willing to develop a relationship. You have to find someone who's willing to develop that relationship with you, an Indigenous, an elder perhaps, or someone where your work is relevant to them. And that can be challenging, but and in fact, that's probably the most challenging part, I think, to do respectful Indigenous research is to connect with an Indigenous person who's willing to be involved. But there are community groups who can facilitate that. Yeah.
I will ask one more question.
Mhm.
This place a little more
I
technical.
just wanted to check if there's any question coming online. Is everything okay? Maybe, yeah, quick question.
Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, go.
This one's a bit more technical. I'm just curious, when you stated your research questions, one of them, if I may, probably, you talked about the confidence and capacity. Could you just bring the research questions?
There you are.
Yeah.
Slide 13.
Yep.
So
Teachers, that's the thing I want to touch. So you talk about confidence and capacity. How could you measure those if you already reached or met the criteria for that research question? So basically you are asking this, right? This is what I really want to achieve. How are you going to measure if the teachers increase their confidence and capacity?
So when talking to our educationalists, sometimes it was they themselves. They could say what helped them develop confidence or what helped their colleagues to develop confidence. And in the case of other people who had a more coordination role, they were aware of how they were able to build confidence. But it's mostly through, it wasn't necessarily quantified. Confidence wasn't necessarily quantified or assessed in a rigorous way. So, but you know, research is a constant cycle where you raise questions like you have just then, and then you might promote some sort of empirical study where you record the confidence. So, you know, we did a part of that study looking at artwork and how that affected teacher confidence. We had interviews with teachers before and after some training to see how that developed their confidence. So we were able to give an empirical kind of assessment of that, but it wasn't necessarily quantified. It was more of a qualitative response.